Hi, my name is Jamie with Chegg Tutors. Today I want to talk to you about the Harlem Renaissance, a Black or African American literary movement in the 1920s and 1930s. The Renaissance was a literary movement and it was centered in Harlem, as we might guess from the name, but it also spread to places as far away as Paris and all around the Northeast and American Midwest. It was also not just African American writers, but people from the Caribbean and other groups who had a history of social oppression and maybe their parents or their grandparents were slaves. This was as much a political and a social movement as a literary movement. Now, Renaissance means rebirth, and this was really the rebirth of an African American tradition that had existed in Africa and to some extent in the folk traditions of slaves in America, a rebirth in the North of the United States, out of the South, expanding to all of America, and taking a mostly illiterate oral tradition of literature and making it into an educated, literate tradition that captured the attention and the assimilation and the appropriation of white America. So the artists who really led this Renaissance might have had grandparents or parents who were slaves. They were part of the Great Migration North, where after Reconstruction in the South, after the Civil War, many blacks migrated north, going to cities where they had jobs in factories, and where, as artists, they could collaborate with other intellectuals and other educated members of a new black middle class, and really do a lot more and have a lot more social contact than they would in the rural South. Harlem, in particular, attracted a black middle class and also an educated middle class that went beyond black people. It attracted the attention of a mainstream white audience, and it included all kinds of arts: jazz like Duke Ellington, Jelly Roll Morton, dance, theater, visual art, plays, novels, as well as poetry. Some themes about the movement. It was a literary movement, but it was also a political movement. For example, later on, James Baldwin would write the manifesto, The Fire Next Time, talking about black identity in America and what it meant for the white America as a whole. It also meant, because there was more widespread attention to black artists, that white artists exploited black culture. This was the beginning of that, where they took jazz, which was inherently a black art form, and rebranded it for a wider audience. There were other things going on, like I said, besides the Renaissance being a literary movement. There was racial pride, as exemplified in the Back to Africa movement, where people were so intensely interested and were so disillusioned and angry with slavery, with the history of black people in the United States, that people like Marcus Garvey said, back to Africa. Let's ignore what's happened in America, go back to our roots, and that's where we should build our identities. Now, at the same time, another theme is that people were trying to navigate their sense of isolation from white America versus their sense that they wanted to be included in America and write themselves into history. So they promoted progressive politics, even socialist politics, and they thought maybe talented art would uplift the race. So at the same time that they wanted to create a unique black identity, they also wanted to show white America that they had an educated, literate tradition of their own that they could make without white help and relying on traditions, folk traditions, and other traditions from Africa and from slavery times. Now, there are many authors who are famous from this movement. Some of them we'll talk about later are Langston Hughes, a poet, maybe the most famous person to come out of the Harlem Renaissance, as well as Zora Neale Hurston, who was a folklorist, trained as a folklorist, but also wrote a famous novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, and other short stories and dialect fiction, which we'll also talk about later. There was a real sense during this movement that people were not just creating art, but creating a movement self-consciously. They had articles and manifestos about their movement in newspapers, and magazines like the New Negro. And there was a sense that because for so long, slaves, for example, had mostly been illiterate, and there was so strong of an oral tradition, now Black people were writing themselves into American history self-consciously by creating a literate tradition and by having themes in that tradition that really often revolved around literacy. A very common theme in the literature of the time was for a young boy often to think that a book was speaking to him because they had that oral tradition but were learning or were forbidden to learn how to read. Really, we can remember the Harlem Renaissance by a later quote that says, "The personal is political." People were writing about their own experiences or their experiences as members of a Black race that they were forming as an identity, but it was really also for political and not just artistic reasons. Let's take a look at some of the work that actually came out of the Harlem Renaissance specifically and see some of these tensions and the desire for integration and isolation in action. So this is Langston Hughes' poem, or part of it, Theme for English B. The setting is Langston Hughes is in an English class. He's told to write about who he is, and he has a lot of difficulty with that as a Black American. At first he says, "We two, you, me, we talk on this page. I hear New York too. Me? Who? That is, who am I? Well, I like to eat, sleep, drink, and be in love." Here he's not invoking an identity that's specifically African American. He's really trying to appeal to the common man and saying, look, we have a lot in common. Later on, though, he says, "I guess being colored doesn't make me not like the same things other folks like who are other races." He's really thinking about maybe we want integration, maybe there are ways in which we're not so different from you, and I want you, white America, to realize this. But then, at the end, and this isn't the end of the poem, he says, "So will my page be colored that I write?" That is, if you saw his writing and didn't know his race or who the author was at all, would you realize that this was from a Black man? This really ties into the themes of passing as white, whether passing is a good thing or a bad thing, and how much Black people should strive for integration or for separation and return to their roots. This also was not a thing that was a unified opinion of the Black community. Some people believed we should separate, some people were more conservative, some people were more liberal, some people were socialists. But there was this sense that around the Harlem Renaissance, around this art that they were creating, they created a common community, whatever their differences. Let's look at a brief quote by Zora Neale Hurston, who was a folklorist she trained in anthropology as a folklorist, and she gathered stories from all across the American South and the Caribbean, but she also wrote the famous novel Their Eyes Were Watching God. She writes prose, she writes essays, and in that way she's the quintessential member of the Harlem Renaissance. She works across genres, she works for political reasons, she incorporates the oral tradition, but she also writes herself into the American literary tradition. So first, in a collection of essays that's actually called I Love Myself When I Am Laughing, she says, "I love myself when I am laughing, and then again when I am looking mean and impressive." This is the voice of someone who is asserting their identity, and who's not saying that this is a Black identity or any particular identity. That doesn't mean she's colorblind, but she's asserting that to white America and to her peers that there is more to being Black than slavery. There is more to being Black than our history, and you shouldn't just consider us politically. You should consider us as individuals, too. I am someone who laughs. I am someone who can look impressive, and you should know that about me. I am someone who loves myself despite all the messages that I'm getting from my community. Now, the second quote is from Their Eyes Were Watching God. And we can see, again, this is touching universal themes like love. But Zora Neale Hurston is doing this in dialect. And that was a big concern in the era. Does writing in dialect make us look uneducated? Is writing in dialect asserting our culture? Or is it making fun of it? Should we write in dialect, or should we write like everyone else in America does? Does everyone in America write the same way? There are so many questions around the Harlem Renaissance. These are two authors who give us answers to some of them, but you should really explore all of the great literature and the interesting politics and history that the Harlem Renaissance has to offer. See you